Land, capital, labor, and the entrepreneur, the four economic resources. The definition and understanding of the study of economics revolves around the burden of scarcity. These economic resources of land, capital, labor, and the entrepreneur are scarce relative to human wants. Economics is all about doing the best with the least, how to maximize production using the least number of resources to satisfy the greatest number of human wants. This is the simple circular flow model. This model was presented earlier in the term, but we're going to revisit this model to emphasize a few key points related to our study of the demand for resources. In this model, there are two markets. The resource market, up top, the green rectangle, land, capital, labor, and the skills of the entrepreneur, and the product market, down bottom. Product markets are simply goods and services available for consumers to purchase. There are two market participants. On the left-hand side, you have businesses, and on the right-hand side, you have households. Supply and demand, market forces determine price and equilibrium price and quantity in markets. In the resource market, businesses are the buyers, the demand side of the market. Households are the sellers, the supply side of the market. In the product market, the situation reverses. Businesses become the sellers of products and services. Households become the buyers. Let's discuss the importance of free market capitalism and private ownership of economic resources. In a system of free market capitalism, one of the principal economic ideas is households ultimately own the economic resources used as a means of production. So households own land, capital, the two property resources, and labor and the skills of the entrepreneur, the two human resources. Businesses look to acquire resources because they need resources to manufacture and produce goods and services. So let's follow the lines to make sense of our circular flow. In the resource market, households bring resources of land, capital, and labor to the market as sellers. The orange arrow from households to resources signifies this process. What do households receive for selling economic resources? Well, land receives rent. Capital receives interest income. Labor receives wages, and the entrepreneur, if successful, receives profit. For businesses, expenditures in the resource market are referred to as cost of production. Cost of production were covered in a previous chapter. Businesses make expenditures to acquire the resources necessary to produce goods and services. So we can follow the black arrow from businesses, expenditures, which are known as cost of production, which generate income for the owners of the economic resources. The inputs provided by households, the orange arrow from households to resources, resource market, becomes resources for businesses. Focusing our attention now on the product market, as stated earlier, the situation reverses. Businesses use the resources acquired in the product market to make goods and services available in businesses use the resources acquired in the resource market to make goods and services available in the product market. So if you follow the income arrow from resource market to households, households sell resources ultimately to have income for consumption expenditures in the product market. These consumption expenditures, the black arrow from households to product market, ultimately provide the revenue that businesses need to pay for resources. And households take home the goods and services that businesses made available in the product market. A couple key ideas here. First, something we're going to investigate in more detail throughout the chapter. A concept economists call derived demand. If you think about the demand for land, capital, labor, and the entrepreneur, one might falsely assume that because businesses are the buyers of the economic resources that it is the business demand for resources that ultimately determines how much of each of the four economic resources are demanded by businesses. However, this is incorrect because Adam Smith introduced an important principle of free market capitalism: consumer sovereignty. Consumers decide the number of goods and services they want to purchase based on the utility that each product and service provides. How useful is a good or service to households? So households, individuals who make expenditures in the product market, signal to businesses the number of resources necessary to produce the products and services that maximize households' utility, happiness, and satisfaction. That's what we mean by derived demand. If you think about the demand for resources in the resource market, it's ultimately determined not just by the demand that businesses make in this market for these resources, but how useful households believe the goods and services to be. Right? If a product becomes more popular or more useful, businesses will need to acquire more resources in the resource market to produce that product or service. Obviously, if a product or service falls out of favor, the demand for that resource will ultimately fall based on the market signals of consumer sovereignty. Another important idea associated with the circular flow model is incomes that households generate from selling resources in a resource market are not altogether equitable. If you think about which resources demand the highest pay, it's entertainers, it's CEOs, it's Wall Street bankers, it's athletes, right? So the purchasing power of households is ultimately determined by the quality and desirability of the resources they own, which leads to an interesting dilemma in economics. Because some resources are valued more than others, it generates income inequality. So if you think about the demand for resources and the level of inequality in the United States, it can ultimately be traced back to this idea of the derived demand for economic resources. Let's begin our economic analysis of resource pricing. Previously in our study of microeconomics, students were introduced to the chapter referred to as the theory of the firm. This chapter introduced students to cost of production. All firms, all businesses, every going concern hires a certain level of land, capital, labor, and the skills of the entrepreneur. So firms' demand for resources is ultimately going to impact the price of those resources. Although firms need all four types of resources, land, capital, labor, and the skills of the entrepreneur, our economic energies in this chapter will focus on the resource pricing of labor. The concepts and principles used to determine resource price of labor are equally applicable to the other resources. Therefore, as an introductory class, we don't need to single out each resource pricing investigation. We'll focus our energies on one resource, labor, and the skills we learn to determine resource pricing of labor will be applicable to the other types of resources. Now, why are resource prices so important? Why is this such an important microeconomic concept to investigate? If we think about money, income, and the determination of a household's financial well-being, standing, and wealth, in a system of free market capitalism, we have private ownership of economic resources. Land receives rent, capital receives interest, labor receives wages, and if successful, the entrepreneur receives profit. Because households privately own economic resources, the value of these resources being determined by resource pricing and the demand for resources, the level of income generation that is possible by an individual or a household is going to be determined by their ownership of resources and how much demand there is or there are for these specific resources in the marketplace. In simple English, in a system of free market capitalism, one's economic well-being is determined by how many economic resources they own and how much demand there is for the economic resources they possess. The second reason why resource pricing is important to study is this focus on what businesses call cost minimization. You remember the term productive efficiency. Businesses want to adopt the least cost method of production to maximize profits. So rule number 2 or policy number 2 up here, issue number 2, cost minimization, the idea that resource prices are important because businesses constantly want to adopt the least cost method of production, and they will do this by focusing on resource pricing and using the combination of resources that will minimize their cost of production. A third reason why resource prices are important is because of the overall resource allocation which will take place within a domestic or global economic situation. So if you think about the various resources available in any economic setting and how those resources are allocated, resource pricing will determine the best combination of land, capital, and labor, and the skills of the entrepreneur, which will maximize efficiency for society. A good example of this might be the current transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy, and the idea that nothing is free. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So even the quote-unquote renewable clean energies come with a cost. And what combination of, what allocation of power generating resources is the best resource allocation for the nation. Finally, the fourth reason why resource pricing is important is policy issues. Such policy issues such as minimum wage laws, agricultural subsidies, and income inequality. We will revisit some of these issues later on in this particular video. For now, simply identify the idea that resource prices ultimately determine the value of any resource in the market and therefore have huge impact on those policy questions. Now we will launch our investigation into resource demand in earnest. As we introduce our investigation of resource demand, we make an important assumption. Bullet point number 1 up here, all markets are competitive. Remember from our study of microeconomics, there are 4 market models: pure competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. In a purely competitive industry, there are a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. And we determine that the price of a good, a service, or in this case a resource, is ultimately determined by the invisible hand, the rationing function of prices, the market forces of supply and demand. For instance, think about Amazon, Walmart, large supermarket chains, fast food restaurants. They pay all workers the same wage. Assuming that the workers have the same level of experience, they all receive the same hourly wage, which means that it's a purely competitive market for the labor resource. Obviously, the assumption of goods being sold in a purely competitive market is a little bit more of a stretch. We did discuss in our study of the 4 market models that It's rather rare to find a purely competitive market. Agriculture was a good example of a purely competitive market. However, remember, pure competition is the paradigm or the model of economic efficiency. It's also a good place to start in an introductory course. So when we launch our investigation into resource demand, we're going to start by assuming that all markets are competitive and that labor, the resource which we will concentrate our economic energies and efforts, is hired in the competitive markets. Second bullet point up here. We said this before when we revisited the circular flow model on the previous slide, but it's important to investigate and emphasize in more detail. The demand for resources is what economists refer to as derived demand. In other words, the demand for resources is made up of two characteristics. First, the efficiency of the resource. Look at this bullet point that says productivity of resource, MP meaning marginal product. From our study of the theory of the firm and cost of production, we remember marginal product refers to the increase in total production associated with hiring the next unit of a resource, in this case, labor. If you add one more worker to the factory, how much does total production increase? What is the marginal product of the next worker? That's a measure of the economic efficiency of that particular resource, the labor resource. So part of the demand for resources is determined by the efficiency of the resource. The other aspect of the demand for resource is the price of the good that the resource helps to produce. So if you think about how valuable is the resource, well, the resource has value because obviously if you add a worker to the factory, that new labor input is going to increase output, but how much can you sell the output for? What's the price of the good in the market? Therefore, the demand for a resource is derived demand. It's derived from two characteristics, both the efficiency of the resource, marginal product, and the price the firm expects to sell the product. So if you add these two aspects of derived demand together, we can now introduce marginal revenue product, our last bullet point on this slide. And it's simply the change in total revenue resulting from unit change in resource. In other words, as the firm adds another worker to the factory, how much do they expect total revenue to increase with the next unit of labor input? Students will remember from our examination of the four market models, pure competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition, when determining for a firm whether they're operating in any of those four market models, what quantity of output will maximize profit or minimize loss, the firm should employ the MR equals MC rule. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is a rule the firm uses to determine quantity of output. So from the standpoint of output, the firm will determine what level of production, what total level of output will maximize profits or minimize loss in the short run by equating the marginal revenue, the additional revenue the firm receives from producing and selling the next unit of output, relative to the marginal cost. How much do costs increase by producing the next unit of outputs? When examining resource demand, we're examining now from the standpoint of inputs. So we're going to employ a similar sounding rule, but this is looking at the firm from the other perspective. In other words, instead of looking or examining the firm's level of output to determine how many units the firm should produce to maximize profit and minimize loss, we're now determining how many units of input, how much resource should the firm employ in the short run. So the rule is MRP equals MRC. What is MRP? Marginal revenue product. Take a look at the mathematical calculation for marginal revenue product. Change in total revenue over unit change in resource quantity. In this case, and remember, we're examining the labor resource, and we're always going to be asking how much will the next worker increase total revenue. So our denominator, unit change in resource quantity, will be 1. So change in total revenue over 1, in essence, marginal revenue product for our analysis can be summed up as how much does the firm expect to increase revenue by hiring the next worker, by increasing the labor input by 1 unit. Likewise, if we look at MRC, the mathematical representation of this equation, change in total resource cost over unit change in resource quantity. Again, we're going to be analyzing the cost of hiring 1 more worker, so our denominator will be 1, so it's change in total resource cost over 1. In essence, this is the cost of hiring the next worker in a competitive market, what we have to pay that next worker. So when we bring these two together, marginal revenue product, marginal resource cost, it can be explained as simple as the following. It makes sense for the firm to demand the next unit of labor inputs, assuming that the marginal revenue product, that is to say the increase in total revenue the firm expects to enjoy from hiring the next worker, or accrue from hiring the next worker, is greater than or equal to the cost of hiring that change in or next unit of labor resource. On the previous slide, we introduced the term marginal revenue product. On this slide, we will explain ultimately why the firm's marginal revenue product represents its demand schedule for labor resource. So again, the purpose of this slide is to explain why the firm's marginal revenue product ultimately represents the firm's demand schedule for the labor resource. Let's review some important microeconomic principles covered earlier in the course on our way to explaining why MRP, marginal revenue product, equals the firm's or equates to the firm's labor demand schedule. Focus your attention on columns 1 and 2. Column 1 is simply the units of resource or number of workers employed by the firm. Column 2 is simply total product, in other words, total number of units produced. So if this firm hires 0 workers, they produce 0 level of output. If the firm hires 1 worker, output increases from 0 to 7. The total product associated with 1 worker is 7. If this firm hires 6 workers, it will expect to produce 27 units of output. So column 1 and column 2 are simple enough to explain. Now focus your attention on column 3. Remember, marginal revenue product is an explanation of why there is derived demand for economic inputs, in this case the labor resource. Remember, a portion of the demand for the labor resource is determined by the efficiency or productivity of that labor resource. Column number 3, marginal product, is a measure of the economic efficiency of each successive unit of labor inputs. How do we calculate column number 3? If the firm hires the first worker, total production increases from 0 output to 7. Therefore, the marginal product associated with the first worker is 7. Total product increases by 7 when the firm hires 1 labor unit of resource. If the firm hires another worker, total product increases from 7 to 13. Therefore, the marginal product of the second worker is 6 because total product increases from 7 to 13. Therefore, the change in total product associated with the second worker is 6. The marginal product of the third worker is 5 because total production increases from 13 to 18 as the firm hires that third worker. Therefore, the marginal product of the third worker is 5. Notice the pattern. The marginal product of each successive unit of labor input is less than the previous units of labor input. If you remember from our previous study, this is referred to as the law of diminishing marginal returns. In the short run, when the size of the factory is fixed, when the size of the firm is fixed, when the capital resource is fixed, the law of diminishing returns explains that as we add a variable input, labor, to our fixed resource capital, output declines with each successive unit of labor input. And the economic rationale behind the law of diminishing returns is rather straightforward. The size of our factory floor and the number of machines available inside the factory are limited, fixed. Therefore, we can't expect to keep adding workers to our factory and also simultaneously expect production or output to increase. As we add workers to our factory, initially it's highly efficient, but then the factory floor starts to become congested and eventually we run out of space. Therefore, in the short run, we would expect the firm to experience the law of diminishing marginal returns, and that's reflected in column 3. Column 4 is simply the price that this firm expects to sell its product. Remember, we made the assumption that this firm is operating in a purely competitive market. We mentioned that assumption on the previous slide. So in column number 4, you notice that this firm is a price taker. The firm can sell every unit of output at the same price. No matter how many units they sell them each for $2. Column number 5 is likewise review for us masters of microeconomics, total revenue. Total revenue is simply price times quantity. So if you look at column number 2, quantity of output, and you multiply that by column number 4, the price, it equates to, or is the mathematical representation of, total revenue. So this firm hires one worker, they produce 7 units of output. With 7 units sold at $2, this total revenue is $14 for the firm. If this firm hires 3 workers, they will produce 18 units of output, and therefore 18 times 2, total revenue would be $36. So column 2 multiplied by column 4 represents the firm's total revenue. Now the all-important column number 6. Remember, marginal revenue product derived from both the productivity/efficiency of the resource, which is measured by column 3, marginal product, along with the price of the product itself. In other words, when you think about the idea of derived demand, 2 parts to the demand for this resource, labor, a portion of the demand is determined by the efficiency of the resource, and a portion is determined by at what price the firm can expect to sell the product. So if we multiply column 3, marginal product, the measure of efficiency of the labor resource, times column 4, the price of the product, we therefore can calculate column number 6, which is simply marginal revenue product. So the marginal revenue product of the first worker is 14. Right? Marginal product 2 multiplied by price of the product, marginal product 7 multiplied by price of the product 2, marginal revenue product is 14. Notice that the marginal revenue product of each successive worker declines. Now remember, what is this telling the firm, marginal revenue product? This is telling the firm as they add that next worker to the factory, to the firm, how much they will expect revenue to increase. So this firm hires the 3rd worker, they would expect that total revenue will increase by $10 by adding the 3rd worker. We can now use the data calculated in column 6, marginal revenue product, to construct the firm's labor demand schedule. Again, we're assuming that the firm hires labor, or the labor market is a purely competitive market. So those 2 assumptions we made previously, that the firm sells its product in a purely competitive industry, and that the firm hires labor in a purely competitive labor market. On the horizontal axis, we're simply measuring the number of workers this firm desires to hire. That is labeled quantity of resource demand, in this case labor demand. On the vertical axis, we're measuring the price or the wage rate. So if we think logically, it says this firm will therefore equate the marginal revenue product of the worker to how many workers it desires to hire based on the price that they have to pay for those workers. So therefore, if the price of wages is, say, $12, this firm understands that the marginal revenue product of the second worker is $12. This firm will therefore hire 12 workers. Simply put, this firm decides how many workers it should hire based on the marginal revenue product of each worker, understanding that they will hire workers as long as the revenue associated with hiring that worker is equal to the wage they have to pay each worker. Let's advance our discussion further to the determinants of resource demand. The idea or term determinants should be familiar to students from the study of markets. There were 5 non-price determinants of demand and 6 non-price determinants of supply. When analyzing markets, these demand shifters or supply shifters caused a change in equilibrium and therefore price and quantity in the market to also change, a new equilibrium price and quantity. In a similar fashion, there will be determinants of resource demand. The first determinant of resource demand is the change in product demand. So if a product grows more popular, or there's an increase in the number of buyers, or there's a decrease in the price of a substitute, there will be an increase in the demand for a product. Let's use a real world example. Assume that new homes become more popular. A rightward shift in the demand for new homes increases equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in the market for new homes. This in turn will increase the demand for resources associated with the production of new homes, such as construction workers. The next factor we have to consider is productivity. Remember, productivity is a measure of input per units of output. The first factor underneath the change in productivity is the quantities of other resources. So the marginal productivity of any resource, it's going to vary with the quantities of other resources used with it. So for instance, the greater the amount of capital and land resource used with labor, the greater will be labor's marginal productivity and therefore labor demand. Another factor affecting productivity will be technological advance. So any type of improvements, technological improvements, which increase the quality of other resources, such as capital, they're going to have the same effect on the demand for labor, right? That's generally the way it works. The better the quality of capital, the greater the productivity of labor used, and therefore the more demand for labor resources. The last one, as far as changes in productivity, will be quality of variable resources, or the quality of the variable resource. So improvements in the quality of a variable resource. So think about labor, right? In other words, if there's an increase in the marginal product of labor, there will be an increase in demand for that resource. So if adding an additional worker increases output by more than in the past, therefore the marginal product of that worker is higher, there's going to be an increase in demand for workers. So considering all these factors, it helps explain the disparity in wages between modern industrialized countries, Japan, Germany, France, the US, and developing nations, Angola, Ethiopia, Cambodia, right? Because in advanced countries, Workers are generally, better trained, had exposure to and the advantage of a better education, and may even be healthier, right, than in some of these countries, right? So in most in most industries, they work in larger and more efficient settings where capital is used more efficiently, and therefore the wages earned by these workers in modern industrialized countries is greater because they add more to total output. Another determinant of resource demand is the change in price of a substitute resource. Assume a firm is using a certain level of capital, machinery, equipment, and a certain level of labor to produce desired level of output. Now assume that the price of capital, the machinery, drops relative to labor. So the price of labor remains the same and the price of capital has fallen. So machines are less expensive. The marginal resource cost of capital, machinery, has fallen. This will in turn incentivize the firm to increase its demand for machinery. So when you think about how this change in the price of machinery, capital, will affect labor, there are two forces working sort of tug of war when you talk about the demand for labor. First, a decline in the price of machinery and the price of capital will mean firms will decide to replace labor resource with capital input, substituting machines for workers. So the substitution effect decreases the demand for workers. Now, an interesting development is that adding more machines, efficient machines, to the factory, to the firm, allows the firm to increase output at a lower cost. The increase in output, in turn, actually increases the demand for labor. To determine the total or net effect of the decrease in the price of machinery on the demand for labor, the economist must consider the substitution effect and the output effect in totality. So simply put, if the substitution effect is greater than the output effect, meaning that the firm has decided that the significant decline in the price of machinery makes capital a far more attractive type of economic input resource, even though it increases output by a certain level, most likely labor demand will decline. If the output effect, the total increase in production associated with the less expensive machinery, outweighs the substitution effect, there may actually be an increase in the demand for labor. An interesting real-life example would be what happened in the steel industry. In steel, we would definitely identify the substitution effect outweighing the output effect, and therefore declining the demand for labor in the steel industry. If you look at a ton of steel and the relationship between capital and labor over a 30-year period, the number of workers needed to produce a ton of steel declined from somewhere near 20 down to somewhere near 4. So in essence, capital, machinery, has become so efficient it replaced labor, and the output effect did not come nearly enough, or not to grow nearly enough, to outweigh the substitution effect. The net effect is a significant demand for labor in the steel industry. Recall our discussion of complementary goods and the demand for goods and services in relation to the price of complementary goods and services. One of the non-price determinants of demand is the price of related goods. Related goods are substitutes and complements, in this case complementary goods. The relationship between the price of smartphones and the demand for apps run on smartphones. A decline in the price of smartphones increases the demand for smartphones, also increases the demand for applications that run on smartphones. So we can take this economic knowledge about complementary goods and we can extrapolate it to complementary resources. In other words, what happens in the demand for resource A if there's a decline in the price of resource B, assuming that resource A and resource B are complements. Let's discuss real-world example of computers and computer programmers. The exponential explosion of computerization across the globe over the past 25/30 years has seriously increased the need for computer programming. Technological advancements have significantly declined the price of the PC. So a decline in the price of personal computers has increased the demand for computer programmers. An important caveat about this relationship between complementary good, price of one resource relative to another good. Important to identify the machine must be operated by a person. So a decline in the price of the computer directly increases to the exact proportion the demand for labor because each machine must be operated by a human being. Obviously, this would be a different case if these were self-operating or automatic computers which did program without the assistance of a person. Now, an extension of this analysis, an increase in the demand for computer programming, a significant decline in the price of personal computers, increase in the demand for the labor resource computer software engineers. One of the further analysis we're going to discuss in this chapter is trends, occupational trends over the last 10-20 years and future occupational trends. Think about the American firm measuring the marginal resource cost of hiring the next software engineer. The increase in the need for software engineers influenced many Americans to study software engineering and management information systems. Software engineers in America, as mentioned in the previous slide about the price of resources in modern industrialized nations, much more expensive than in, say, a country like India. So American firms have found it economically desirable to offshore these jobs from the United States to India. Stepping into the realm of practical, recent article from CNBC offered the top 10 jobs expected to grow the most in the next decade. All right, so solar photovoltaic installers, obviously we do with solar energy, wind turbine service technicians. So there is a move towards renewable energy, energy resource economics covered in a different video lecture, but significant decline in fossil fuel demand over the next 10 years. So we talk about, the demand for one resource relative to other resources, substituting renewable energies for fossil fuels will significantly increase the demand for these particular industries. Number 3 and number 4, definitely related to the demographic shift of the United States. Older population going to need more home health aides and more personal care assistance. Notice that a lot of these top 10 are in the healthcare industry. Number 5 is interesting, occupational therapy assistants. So this is an example of when you talk about sort of a substitute and the value of one resource relative to another resource. So you would pay an occupational therapist a higher salary than you would pay an occupational therapist assistant. So healthcare providers constantly looking for ways to reduce cost may hire one occupational therapist and several occupational therapist assistants to work under the one occupational therapist. Again, you talk about the relationship between one resource and another resource. In a healthcare setting, the doctor would write the orders, the occupational therapist would oversee the rehab department, and the occupational therapist assistants service the therapy needs. Right? Information security analysis. Again, physician assistants is again a big move here when you talk about the need for primary care and the in many ways interesting, serious lack of or need for primary care physicians across the United States. Physician assistants, not only in primary care but in other forms of healthcare, including specialties, are becoming the cost-effective choice for healthcare providers. All right, statisticians, again, nurse practitioners and physician assistants, many ways similar. You can look in, take your own time to look up, the rules and regulations on what one can do and what can't do, and it actually varies by state. But again, a nurse practitioner in many ways supplements the services of a doctor or complements the services of a doctor. And then the last one, speech language pathologist, which is an interesting one. I actually, this has to do with communication and swallowing disorders in both children and adults. That was the one that I actually had to kind of cheat and look up and see exactly what a speech language pathologist does. So these are the occupational trends according to research done by CNBC for the next 10 years. In addition to the determinants of resource demand, economists consider elasticity of resource demand. What is demand? It is a schedule of the various amounts of a good or service or a resource buyers are willing and able to purchase, series of prices, specified amount of time, ceteris paribus, other things equal. There's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Price declines, there'll be an increase in quantity demanded. Price rises, there'll be a decrease in quantity demanded. Economists refer to this as the law of demand. However, economists are interested in measuring how responsive are buyers to change in price. How responsive are buyers to change in price? If price declines, will buyers purchase lots more or just little more? If price increases, will there be significantly less purchased or just slightly less purchased? This same idea of elasticity can be applied to resource demand. The formula for elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. The formula for elasticity of resource demand is percentage change in resource quantity over percentage change in resource price. This formula will yield an outcome, a mathematic number. Interpreting the number is straightforward. If the elasticity of resource demand is greater than 1, economists refer to the elasticity of resource demand for that particular resource to be relatively elastic. That is to say, firms, producers, the buyers of the resource are quite responsive to the change in the price of that resource. Any outcome less than 1, so if the coefficient of elasticity of resource demand is calculated to be something less than 1, economists interpret that result as inelastic, that producers, the firm, is not all that responsive to the change in price of this particular resource. Economists consider 3 factors, identify 3 characteristics which highly influence the elasticity of resource demand. The first is the ease of resource substitutability. How easy is it for the firm to substitute one resource with another resource? The typical investigation involves replacing labor with capital. How easy is it for the firm to replace workers with machines? If it is relatively easy for the firm to replace labor with capital, to replace workers with machines, economists expect the elasticity of resource demand for labor, the elasticity of labor resource demand to be highly elastic, that is to say, responsive to changes in resource price. In this case, changes in prices of wages. So if the price of wages increases, we would expect a significant decline in the demand for a labor resource and look for firms to replace labor with machines. The fast food industry provides a real-life application of this scenario. Currently, fast food industry is dominated by low-cost labor. Many workers in these low-skilled jobs include teenagers and young people earning at or slightly above the minimum wage. If the government were to force the hand of producers, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Chick-fil-A, Sonic, Taco Bell, fast food producers, if the state government or federal government or some combination of the two raises minimum wage, fast food producers will look to replace higher cost laborers with machinery. Change from labor to technologically advanced machinery. The second factor is elasticity of product demand. This one should be relatively straightforward to understand. If the demand for a product or service is relatively elastic, that is to say, consumers are relatively responsive to changes in price, then the demand for the resources necessary to produce that good or service will also be relatively elastic. We expect elasticity of resource demand to be highly elastic if the demand for the product in question is highly elastic. The opposite would be the case if the demand were inelastic. The demand for gasoline is highly inelastic. There are no close substitutes for gasoline, and gasoline is a necessity. Therefore, we would expect, since the demand for gasoline is highly inelastic, we would expect the elasticity of resource demand for all resources necessary to produce gasoline to be also highly inelastic, aka oil. Significant price in oil is not going to alter the decision by gasoline producers to purchase this resource. Ratio of resource cost to total cost, our last factor to consider. The higher the ratio of the resource cost to the total cost, the more elastic is the resource demand for that particular resource. So when considering elasticity of resource demand, the higher the percentage that resource is to total cost of production, the greater the elasticity of resource demand for that resource. If labor is 50% of cost of production, we would expect that elasticity for the labor resource to be highly elastic, because changes in the price of the resource will be quite noticeable to the firm, as opposed to a resource which only represents 10% of the firm's total production. We would expect the elasticity of resource demand for that resource to be highly inelastic. Thus far, we have focused our attention on one input, labor. However, firms need to employ and hire all economic resources: land, capital, labor, and the entrepreneur. So how does the firm determine the optimal combination of resources? Right? How does the firm choose this optimal combination? Right? Well, the first assumption we must employ here is we are dealing the period known as the long run. In the long run, all resources are variable, including capital, the size of the firm. So assuming that all resources, all inputs are variable, It will help us determine the firm's optimal combination of resources. Now, the firm answers this question, what combination of land, capital, labor, and the entrepreneur best suits the efficiency needs of the firm, by answering two questions. First, what combination of resources will minimize cost of producing any given level of output the firm desires to produce? Right? And the second one is, what combination of resources maximizes profit? In regards to the first idea, the combination of resources, land, capital, and labor in the entrepreneur, that minimizes cost of production at any given level of output, students can refer to the cost of production chapter and the long run average total cost curve. The long run average total cost curve reflects graphically the combination of the combination of resources that will minimize the firm's cost of producing at any given level of output. Up to this point in our microeconomic analysis of resource demand, we've been concentrating our economic efforts on the efficiency of labor. Obviously, firms need to hire a combination of resources to produce goods and services, some combination of land, capital, and labor. The purpose of this slide is to answer the question, how does the firm decide what combination of the resources, land, capital, labor, will minimize cost of production for a given or specific level of output? The firm is going to employ the least cost rule. So if you look down bottom, it says the marginal product of labor over the price of labor. So here's the idea. The firm will say, okay, if we're trying to figure out what combination of land, capital, and labor will minimize cost of production for the firm for a given level of output, say the firm wants to produce 50 units of output, they're going to follow the least cost rule, which says that the last dollar spent on each resource yields the same marginal product. All right, so let's think about what that means. The last dollar spent on each resource yields the same marginal product. So we already know what marginal product is. It's the change in total product associated with hiring the next worker. Well, we could also measure marginal product of saying the change in total product associated with employing the next machine, right? So the idea here is that the firm will minimize cost of production for a given level of output by making certain that the last dollar spent on each resource yields the same marginal product. So to reinforce the least cost rule, we'll provide a mathematical example which will clear the idea of how the firm decides what combination of labor and capital, what combination of resources will minimize the firm's cost of production for a given level of output. So remember, our least cost rule states that the last dollar spent on each resource yields the same marginal product if the firm wants to minimize cost for a given level of output. So the first thing about our data on this slide that you should be aware of and notice is that it says up top the firm desires to produce 50 units of output. So total product for the firm is going to be 50. So now the firm wants to figure out which combination of resources, in this case labor and capital, will minimize cost of production to produce 50 units of output. Right? Now we have the equation here where the firm will figure out where the last dollar spent on each resource yields the same marginal product by equating the marginal product of labor over the price of labor. That must equal the marginal product of capital over the price of capital. So we know the firm wants to produce 50 units of output. Now we're trying to figure out what combination of inputs, in this case labor and capital, will minimize cost of production. Two other pieces of information are given in this data that are vitally important. It tells us that the price of labor is $8 per unit. That's given up top there. See, it says labor price $8. Likewise, the cost of or the price of capital is $12. right? So each capital input costs $12. Therefore, we now know the denominators on each side of our equation, right? The price of labor is $8, the price of capital is $12. Now we have to figure out a ratio where these two are equal. That will help us figure out where the last dollar spent on the labor resource yields the same marginal product as the last dollar spent on the capital resource. Concentrate your energies now on columns 3 and 3 prime. Column 3 gives us the marginal product of labor. Column 3 prime tells us the marginal product of capital. So if we hire 3 workers, the marginal product of the third worker is 6. Therefore, we will have an equation of 6 over 8 on the left-hand side. The marginal product of the third worker is 6 over the price of labor of 8, 6 over 8. 6 over 8 reduced works out to be 3/4. We have to find what level of capital input will give us the same fraction. Notice that in column 3 prime, the marginal product of the second unit of capital is 9. 9 marginal product of 2 capital inputs over 12, the price of capital, can also be reduced to 3/4. Therefore, we have determined that this firm, to minimize cost to produce 50 units of output, should hire 3 workers and use 2 units of machinery / capital inputs, right? So that's 6 over 8 equals 9 over 12. Now, a good question you might be asking yourself is, how do we know that if the firm hires 3 workers and utilizes 2 machines, that they will produce the desired level of 50 units of output? We'll look at total product in column 1 and total product in column 1 prime. This tells us the number of output or the level of output associated with the labor input and the level of output associated with the capital input respectively. Notice that the firm hires 3 workers, they produce 28 units of output. And if the firm hires 2 capital, the 2 capital yields an additional 22 units of output. 28 plus 22 equals 50. Therefore, with the firm hiring 3 units of labor input and 2 units of capital input, the last dollar spent on each resource, labor and capital respectively, yields the same marginal product, and this firm has minimized cost for 50 units of output. One final note on this concept. This should help reinforce the idea of the combination of resources that minimizes cost. This firm could hire 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 workers, which would contribute 37 towards 37 units of output, or 37 units of total product, and 1 machinery, which would contribute 13 towards total product, 13 level of output, and 37 plus 13 would also equal 50. So this firm could produce 50 units of output by hiring 5 workers and using 1 machine or 1 unit of capital input, and also achieve a level of output of 50. However, that would not minimize the cost. In other words, the purpose of this exercise is to figure out which combination of labor and capital minimizes total cost of production for the firm at 50 units of output. Only if the firm hires 3 workers and uses 2 capital will the firm minimize cost of production for producing 50 units of output. Other combinations of labor and capital are possible to produce 50 units of output. However, those combinations of resources will not minimize cost. So the firm must answer a second question. And the second question the firm wants to answer is, what combination of resources and outputs will maximize profits? So the profit maximization rule states that in a competitive market, the price of the resource must equal its marginal revenue product. So we're going to, through a system of trial and error, determine what level of labor inputs given a certain marginal revenue product of labor will equal the marginal revenue product of capital. So we're going to have to find a situation where these two equal 1. Through a trial and error approach, we can answer the second question of what combination of resources and outputs will maximize the firm's production. Now remember, we're trying to follow the rule for profit maximization that states in a competitive market that the price of the resource must equal its marginal revenue product. So again, it tells us in the data that the price of labor is $8. It also tells us that the price of capital is $12. So now we look at columns 5 and 5 prime respectively. And from a common sense standpoint, through trial and error, we can determine what level of labor inputs and capital inputs will maximize profits, and therefore what total level of output will also maximize profit for this firm. So think of it in these terms. Column 5 tells us the marginal revenue product of each worker. Now we know that it cost us $8 to hire the worker. So when we hire the first worker, that first worker contributes an additional $24 to total revenue. The marginal revenue product associated with hiring the first worker is $24. We're only paying $8 for that worker. So obviously it makes sense to hire the first worker. If we use the same logic and say, okay, what about the second worker? Well, the marginal revenue product of the second worker is $20. Yeah, that makes sense. We're paying $8 for the labor, and that second worker is contributing $20 to marginal revenue, right? So the marginal revenue product of the second worker is greater than the price we're paying for that worker. Same thing with the third worker, same thing with the fourth worker, right? $12 the marginal revenue product of the third worker, $10 the marginal revenue product of the fourth worker. Now look what happens with the fifth worker. The marginal revenue product of the fifth worker exactly equals the wage we pay, the price we pay for that worker. So look at our equation. MRP, marginal revenue product subset L of labor, equals the price of labor. We now know that this firm should hire 5 workers, right? Does that make sense? The marginal revenue product of the fifth worker is 8, and the marginal resource cost is 8. That's 8 over 8 equals 1. Then we perform the same exercise for capital, and we say, okay, we know that the price of capital is $12. That's given to us. We look at column number 5 prime, and we can therefore ask ourselves, how many units of capital should this firm employ? Well, the marginal revenue product of the first unit of capital, 26, then 18, and then 12. Well, there's where we should stop, right? Think of it like this. If we hired or we employed a fourth unit of capital, it cost the firm $12. That fourth machine is only generating $8 additional in revenue. That makes 0 cents. We should stop by hiring, or we should stop at hiring or employing the third unit of capital inputs, right? The marginal revenue product of the third machine is 12. The marginal resource cost of that machine is 12. 12 over 12 equals 1. Therefore, this firm should hire 5 units of labor and employ 3 units of capital. Okay, well, what will be the firm's total revenue and total cost, and therefore profit at this level of labor inputs and capital inputs? All right. Well, we can simply say that total cost is price of labor plus price of capital. If we hire 5 workers at $8 per unit, that's $40 total in labor cost. If we employ 3 level of capital at $12 each, therefore we have total capital cost of 36. We add our labor cost of 40 with our capital cost of 36. The firm's total cost is therefore 76. Now what about total revenue? What we have to look at is say, okay, if we employ 5 units of labor and 3 units of capital, what will be total production? Remember, we can measure that as column 1 and column 1 prime. So with 5 workers contribute 37 to total output. 3 capital can contribute an additional 28 to total output. Therefore, our total output is 65. 37 attributed to labor, 28 attributed to capital. All right, total output, total production is 65. So what's our firm's total revenue? Well, remember, we sell our product at $2 per unit. We're selling in a competitive market, right? That was given in the earlier slide. This firm is a price taker in a competitive market. Therefore, total revenue is simply price, $2, times quantity, 65, which is $130. If we take $130 worth of total revenue minus the $76 worth of total cost, this firm is therefore generating a profit of $54. So in this slide, we determine that the firm should hire 5 workers because the marginal revenue product of the 5th worker equals the price of labor, and the firm should employ 3 units of capital because that 3rd unit of capital, the marginal revenue product of 3rd unit of capital is $12, exactly equal to the price of capital, and therefore the firm will generate a maximized profit of $54 with this combination of labor input and capital input. Our study of the demand for resources and resource pricing, the economic analysis that the firm uses to determine what combination of inputs, which mix of land, capital, and labor will minimize cost of production at a given level of output, and what combination of economic resources will maximize profits based on marginal revenue product and marginal resource cost, ultimately have huge implications on income distribution on a macro scale in the economy, and therefore harken back to the entire study of economics. Remember, economics is a social science studying the activities of human beings in the everyday business of life. Economists are advocates of the marginal productive theory of income. Simplest put, to each according to what he or she creates. According to this theory, right, resources receive pay according to the value of the service. So if you think about the connection between products produced and the inputs necessary to produce those products, workers and resource owners receive income relative to the value of the labor input necessary to produce a certain product and the value of the resources such as capital that are needed to provide goods and services. Owners of these resources are compensated based on their contributions to economic output. In theory, this sounds fair and just. The more a resource contributes to production, the higher it is compensated, assuming that in society, citizens purchase goods and services based on the utility, this sounds like a fair and just system for income distribution. However, it does lead to some inequality questions about fairness and economic justice. In theory, it sounds just and fair to compensate economic resources based on their contribution to total production. In many ways, it aligns with the economic theories of incentives matter, incentivizing laborers to work hard, to innovate, to be creative, to seek out new methods of production, to incentivize entrepreneurs to take risks and invest in capital, ownership of resources, such as to increase the total productivity of the country. Sounds as if it will achieve productive and allocative efficiency for society, and it aligns with many of the ideas of a free market. However, there are some serious criticisms of this theory. First, it assumes that economic resources are distributed equally at the beginning of, let's call it, the economic game. We can easily agree that within individuals, talent, creativity, industriousness, it's simply not distributed equally. Additionally, when you consider land resources and capital resources, many of the owners of these resources were not compensated with these resources through innovation, creativity, or hard work. They simply inherited these resources and had an economic advantage above others before they even started playing the game. So that's one of the criticisms when we talk about productive resources unequally distributed. Another issue is market imperfections. Market imperfections such that monopsony. A monopsony refers to a situation in which one buyer has significant control over the market. Consider Walmart, the United States' largest employer. Because they're such a large buyer in the market for labor, they may have significant control over the price of labor. Other factors of market imperfections. One is unionized work situations. Evaluate the salary of a unionized teacher versus a teacher working at a private school, doing basically the same job. The unionized teacher salary is twice as large with a nice host of unpaid benefits and a secured pension. None of those fringe benefits are in place for the non-unionized private school teacher, and there is no pension. Same thing with a union carpenter versus a private company carpenter. Right? The union carpenter may even be protected by the union for work that we would say is less than perfect or less than competent. Should the free market, through the marginal productivity of income distribution, determine how resources are compensated, or should the government regulate and redistribute? This is the ultimate question of this economic analysis and the last idea debated in this video. Obviously, this is not a simple question to answer. The more regulation, the less innovation. The more you stifle creativity, the slower the economy grows. However, income inequality has become a tremendous talking point among politicians and economists over the past 3 decades. Is it the government's job to regulate the monopsony who may have significant control over the price of labor in the low to middle income labor market? Should the government take measures such as inheritance tax on certain ownership of land and capital resources to achieve a more level playing field for the next generation? Do we need to tax certain incomes which may be compensated above and beyond what we believe is market fairness? Just some ideas to ponder. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this video. See you in future videos.